This section we're going to be looking at the concept of reframing. Reframing is a popular term in many areas of inquiry and domains, from linguistics to cognitive psychology, and it basically involves the concept of rethinking about a particular situation from a different point of view and a different perspective. And as we've seen so far, the creativity really at its core involves breaking out of habit, breaking out of habitual patterns, stereotypes, assumptions, etc., and attempting to sort of move beyond what is known and given and expected into something that is more novel. So frames are defined variously in different domains, but they have to do with the idea of things that we encounter that are based on a particular context and a particular connection to other things. And so our understanding of any particular things always takes place within a greater whole, a greater frame of reference, a greater context of understanding, and that these frames carry with them certain assumptions, certain givens about what is possible, what is not possible. So the idea of reframing is a method by which we change that context of understanding, we shift perspective, and hopefully we're able to open up new possibilities and new ideas. So different perspectives. By looking at things differently, we think about things differently. It's just that simple. There is a story about the African shoe company. Well, it's actually a Czech shoe company, but they're one of the biggest companies in Africa, called Bata. It's an apocryphal story, meaning it might not be true, or seems to always be attached to this company, but no references, or at least I've not been able to find any reference. But regardless of that, the essence of the story is what matters, the lesson or the principle, not whether it's true or not for Bata. So it goes something like this. Bata, like many other shoe companies in Europe and United Kingdom, were trying to break into the African markets at the end of the 19th century. So they sent a couple of salesmen, reps, research and development guys, over to the continent of Africa to see, what are the possibilities? Is this something we can work with? Is this something we can develop or not? And so they both arrived roughly at the same time. They went to their respective hotel rooms, and they both wired back to headquarters immediately. One of them said, "Nobody wears shoes over here. We're wasting our time. Don't even think about it. Let's not do anything about this." The other one said, "Nobody wears shoes over here. We're going to make an absolute fortune." So it's one of those stories that sort of illustrates glass full, glass half empty, half full. They're both looking at the same situation, whereas one person sees limitation, the other person sees possibility. And Bata today is one of the most ubiquitous, famous, well-known companies all over the continent of Africa. And so the way we look at something is huge in terms of the possibilities it allows for us. It has a lot to do with the idea of context, how we approach something, how something is presented to us, what are our assumptions and the horizon of understanding that we bring to something. So if we look at this picture here, we see a bunch of junk. But if we look at that image on the back wall and we isolate it, we decontextualize it from its background, we get something like this. And then if we reframe it, recontextualize it into something, let's say we put a frame around it, all of a sudden it looks like a piece of art. And then the minute we put it in a museum with a barricade and ushers, we've now turned it into high art. If we go backwards, in this context, it's not much. And we move forward, we put it in a museum. And a museum's role, ultimately, is to frame something. Not just literally in terms of a gilded golden frame, but to frame it in terms of a museum, not just a museum, but it's almost like a church just in a religious experience. So you go to a large building, you walk up steps, there's columns, there's this grand entranceway, and you go inside and the whole atmosphere is one of quiet and hush and contemplation and private relationships with the art, much like a church or a synagogue or a mosque. And so by framing art in this way, we take something that in any other circumstance might be seen as a piece of junk, and all of a sudden it becomes worthy of our contemplation and attention. And this whole process is all about seeing differently. And by saying differently, we think about things differently. And this was capitalized on, again in the context of art, by a French artist called Marcel Duchamp, with a piece of work known as Fountain from 1917. This is a piece of work that he submitted to an exhibition under the pseudonym of R. Mutt, so nobody knew it was him. And what he was trying to do was challenge the question of what is art. Uh, it could have been easily rejected. In fact, it was to a degree. But the piece sparked an interest. It made people think about, well, what is art? What makes something art? And Duchamp had a couple of takes on this. One, by putting it in a museum, this is a urinal, a mass-produced urinal, by putting it in a museum, in a gallery, in an exhibition, putting it on a pedestal, giving it a name tag, he's changed the frame of the object. He's changed the thoughts we have about something. It's become different. And the reason he wanted to do this was actually to unveil the whole convoluted network, labyrinthine connection that art or artworks actually have in our society. This work was voted the most influential sculpture of the 20th century by over 500 critics, historians, writers, etc. And the reason it was so historical was because it actually poked holes in the idea that somehow the value or the meaning of a great work of art, for example, is not in the piece of art itself. What makes something great is actually this network of relationships that involves dealers, collectors, critics, historians, artists, and the art markets that surround it. For Duchamp, his point was, it's these things that decide whether something has value. That value is not intrinsic to the object. Value is conferred onto the object by this network of relationships. And so what makes something art is whether or not we as a culture or a society have agreed to the terms of what makes something art. So by taking something really mundane, and there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek jokes with this particular piece, it's something you pee into, and framing it as a work of art. For many people, this was a disrespectful act towards the nobility of art. For others, it was just a complete joke. But for most people, especially since the time, it's a very serious piece of art that actually reframes the concept of how we think about art. For Duchamp, art had nothing to do with the work itself. It had everything to do with the culture and the society that surrounded it. This can be illustrated very easily by asking ourselves, what would happen if we went to sub-Saharan Africa, to a tribe of Bushmen, and introduced them to the Mona Lisa? What do you think they would do? Would they fall down to their knees? Would they worship it? Would they see it as a priceless gem of art? Would they put it on an altar? Would they put a frame around it? Or would they use it as a sunshade, target practice for their arrows, or firewood? Chances are they're not going to do the former. They're not going to look at, well, they might see it as a kind of curiosity and say, well, this is very unusual, it's very different from what we do. But they wouldn't be aware or even acknowledge the idea that this is somehow a great work of art. They would have a completely different relationship to it, thereby sort of betraying the idea that art is really a cultural phenomena, which is what Duchamp was trying to do. And this happens a lot in the arts, whether it's drawing, painting, theater, novels, etc. And it also happens in this particular book called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. This is a book about humanity, the history of humanity, evolution, all of those things, but it's seen from a completely different perspective, in this case the perspective of a gorilla named Ishmael. And what's fascinating about this book is its change in perspective. The gorilla talks to the author and gives us a completely different take on things. And so here's an example of art providing that, and that's one of the major functions of art, is that it gives us different sets of eyes in order through which we can see the world. So reframing is a technique. There's many, many techniques to reframe and to rethink and to recontextualize something. But one of the most popular is to ask why. Why? To be one of those little children that is always saying why. And by doing that, we're able to sort of step out of our immediate concerns regarding something and to see it in the bigger picture. Why are we doing something? And many of our problems and issues are based on this concept. We're actually stuck with the tactic. We're stuck with the detail rather than being able to step out of that detail and see it in a bigger way. So for example, if we were stuck or trying to find a way to build a better bridge for whatever reason, we might ask ourselves, why do you want to build that bridge? By asking why, we step back from the situation. We widen the context of understanding. Why do we want to build this actual bridge? And the answer might be something like to get to the other side. But now the question becomes, it's not about the bridge. The question is, how do we get to the other side? Are there other ways to get to the other side? Can we do this in another way? So rather than being stuck on the bridge and trying to figure out how to make the bridge work, our ultimate goal really is to get to the other side. Well, we could swim, we could take a boat, we could build a tunnel, we could take an air balloon, we can get shot through a cannon, we could zip line. There are lots of ways to get to the other side. So by stepping back, by stepping out of the particular frame, we see things in a much bigger context, and hopefully something like that can help us to problem solve in a much more effective way. In this exercise, you keep going with the why. Why do you want to get to the other side, for example? And we might say something like, to get to work. That's where we work. That's where the office is. That's where the shop is. That's where the plant is. Whatever the reason is, we want to get to work over there. Keep asking why. And we might say, are there other ways to get to work? Do we have to physically be there? Can we work remotely? Can we use the internet? Can we, whatever. We're stepping out of this particular frame and thinking about, is there other ways to do our work but without physically being there? And then we might even ask ultimately, why do you want to get to work? For which the obvious answer would be to make money. And if we kept pushing the why, we might ask, are there other ways to make money? So you can see the goal might have very little to do with designing a better bridge or an effective bridge. And so the why technique, why, allows us to step out of this narrow frame into a much wider frame, and hopefully this wider frame might have some solutions. Another example might be something like this. How do you build a better mousetrap? Let's say your mousetraps aren't working, they're just ineffective. And so you're trying to think, and this is something designers and inventors have been doing for at least a century, trying to devise the best mousetrap, a better mousetrap than the one that exists. But if you ask why do you want to build a better mousetrap? The answer might obviously be to catch mice. But if we now keep going with this, why do you want to catch mice? Well, so they don't come into my house. That raises up a whole different set of possibilities. Is there another way you can keep them out of your house? Well, you probably could think of some. What is it they want in your house? Food, etc. Well, what happens if you put something outside in the garden that it contains food that the mice go to instead of the house? So by stepping back from the situation, by asking why, by widening the frame of context, we're able to look at things in a slightly different perspective, and that might be an opportunity to see things very differently. The other technique is to question assumptions. When we see things in a certain way, we often have a bunch of assumptions that come along with that. By questioning those assumptions, by listing those assumptions, by seeing those assumptions, we can ask ourselves, what are the alternatives to those? Can we do it differently? So let's say, for example, we took the idea of potato chips, and you're a company, and you were trying to develop new potato chips or new ways of doing potato chips. Some of the assumptions you might list might include, well, they're made from potatoes. Everybody knows that. So the minute you write this down or you conceptualize the idea of made from potatoes, you're not very far away from the idea of, well, do they have to be made from potatoes? Can we do them from something else? Another assumption might be they're fried in oil. The minute we acknowledge this, We're not very far from waiting the idea that we don't have to fry it in oil. Maybe we could bake them or find other ways to cook potato chips. They're not healthy. Well, what about healthy potato chips? What about something that's good for you? They come in a bag. Well, can they come in another kind of container? Pringles made a fortune off of this idea. They're usually salty. Most potato chips have a kind of salty flavor to them. But what about if they're sweet or bitter or sour? They have other kinds of primary flavors. The flavors tend to be limited. Most flavors of potato chips you could probably count on two hands. Well, what happens if you had crazy flavored potato chips? So far you can see in the list on the right, many companies have taken this route. They've looked at ways of making the traditional potato chip and just reinvented the concept of the chip or the crisp and come up with vegetable potato chips, baked potato chips, Pringles, unusual flavors, etc. And we can keep going with this. They're crispy, but why do they have to be crispy? What happened if you had some soft potato chips, hard potato chips, chewy potato chips? And then finally, every potato chip tends to come, regardless of the package, in one flavor. They're all the same. Why do they have to be the same? What if every chip had a different flavor? Now, this could be a bag of mixed flavors that are kind of random, sort of bottom of the barrel stuff, or they could be organized in the sense that, let's say we wanted to make a bag of potato chips called Thanksgiving Dinner, in which the flavors of each potato chip, some tasted like turkey, some tasted like mashed potatoes, some tasted like gravy, some tasted like cranberry. And so the experience of eating this bag of potato chips would be akin to, well, somewhat akin to having a Thanksgiving meal. And you could imagine all sorts of different sorts of meals that you could dream up, Chinese takeaways, surf and turf, things like that.